Have you seen the movie War Dogs? You know, the one directed by Todd Phillips, creator of The Joker and The Hangover, the one starring Jonah Hill and Miles Teller. There they still through the triangle of death weapons carried, and in the casino deal of a lifetime concluded. You must have seen it if you open this video. I hate to break it to you, but the lion's share of what was shown in the movie either didn't happen or it was completely different. For example, the War Dogs weapons were never personally delivered through the triangle of death. However, the real story behind the movie is no worse. Here managed to mix and Swiss gun baron and Albanian mafia and the State Department and the U.S. Department of Defense and even George Bush Jr. And at the epicenter of it all were 20-year-old guys who were able to make a $200 million fortune on the sale of weapons, brazenly cheating the first army of the world. And if you're curious to find out what the filmmakers didn't get out of this story, then meet Ephraim Defrauded and David Pacuz on the other side of the law. Miami, a place where the sun never sets and life goes on around the clock. That's where our present-day heroes grew up. They met in 1997 during a study session at the local synagogue. But instead of boring studies, they more often chose to relax on numerous beaches and smoke weed. Later, this habit will transfer with them and into adulthood, and will be reflected in the movie by Todd Phillips. Pacuz's parents moved to Miami when he was still an infant. His family was not characterized by great wealth. Ephraim, on the other hand, came from a wealthy family. His grandfather was one of the largest real estate owners in Los Angeles, and his uncle, Shmuley Bowditch, was no less than the most famous rabbi in the United States, and even a friend and confidant of Michael Jackson. From a young age, Ephraim himself dreamed of earning big money on his own. But it was not the usual desire to just get rich. Defrauded was attracted by the very process of making money, the adrenaline one could get when making a profitable deal. When Defrauded was about 14 years old, he moved from Miami to Los Angeles, where, in addition to his studies, he began working as a laborer at his uncle's warehouse, whose firm sold weapons confiscated by the police. It was a completely legal business. From time to time, the police held auctions, at which stores could at a bargain price to buy weapons previously seized by law enforcement from criminals. When Ephraim turned 16, he left school, and his uncle entrusted him with a place behind the counter, where the young man made the first arms sale of his life. Very small compared to his future exploits, just 2 pistols. The seller's earnings were not particularly large, and Defrauded was not satisfied, and therefore he began to look for new ways to get money, and the internet came to his aid. He was a regular on various gun forums. There sat different people, and some of them also sold their weapons. So Ephraim started buying old weapons from collectors and then selling them at a small markup. The internet also led him to his first work with the state. One day, while surfing the web in search of interesting offers, Ephraim came across FedBizops. It was a site specializing in government contracts and procurement. It was 2003. The U.S. had launched a full-scale military operation in Iraq, and the Department of Defense, which at that moment needed to maintain its own army and several allied armies, needed absolutely everything from tanks to basketballs. Several times a day, the offers on the site were updated, and participating in even the tiniest deal could, in theory, bring a teenager a lot of money. As for how it came about that even someone like Defrauded could bid on goods for the U.S. Army, I'll tell you a little later. Ephraim shared finding the site with his uncle. He was interested and offered him his money to fund the first deals and weapons licenses that might be needed. In return, he demanded from his nephew 60% of the profits these deals could bring in. After only a couple weeks, Ephraim was already able to sign his first contracts, and the next year and a half enriched him personally for the sum of $150,000. The earning scheme itself was simple. Having learned that the army needs some goods, Ephraim found a seller with a favorable price on the internet, and then the same goods, but with a markup, resold to the Pentagon. But soon there was a black cat between the relative partners. Uncle Ephraim was irritated by his nephew's addiction to pot, his failure to observe the Sabbath, and other slacker transgressions. The relationship grew more and more heated every day, and eventually led to a serious quarrel, as a result of which, without receiving from his uncle even half of what he had earned, Ephraim flew to Miami, where he continued to do business on his own with the money he had managed to take. At that time, he had a little more than $40,000. Diveroli's main activity was on Fed Bizops, where he got his first contract, selling 900,000 rounds of 223 caliber ammunition. As soon as he saw this offer, Ephraim immediately began looking for suppliers who could offer him a bargain price on that very ammo. One company in Kentucky was willing to sell the ammunition for $105 per 1,000 rounds. Ephraim would have to pay $94,500 for the whole thing. And that's where it gets interesting. In fact, this was the very first step that opened the door for the young boy to large arms government contracts. But prospects are prospects, and the immediate profit should not be forgotten. He had to set such a price for the goods, which on the one hand would not scare off the buyer, and on the other hand would bring income and himself. He reasoned as follows. A recognized contractor, with a reputation and a lot of deals under his belt, usually demands at least 10%. Ephraim had neither the former nor the latter at the time, so he decided to ask for 9%, and it worked. 3 days later, Ephraim was notified that the deal was now his. Diveroli later recalled, "It was one of the most exciting and yet scary moments of my life. Yes, I had signed my first contract with the Department of Defense, but I had no idea how I was going to fulfill it. The biggest problem was money, or rather, not enough of it. Ephraim had only $30,000 left at that point. Not bad for an 18-year-old, but not so much for an aspiring arms dealer. In addition, the Kentucky salesman demanded full payment for all the ammunition. An offer to pay for the ammunition after delivery was rejected. In order not to lose the deal, Ephraim had to find a supplier who would agree to sell him the ammunition, essentially on credit, at any cost and as soon as possible. And whether he could find such a vendor depended on whether he could stay in the big leagues, where he had just jumped, or whether he would have to go back behind the counter of his hated uncle, because the company that failed to fulfill the deal without a good reason, as a rule, lost any chance of cooperation with the Ministry of Defense in the future. Time was working against Ephraim. He sat on the phone for 18 hours a day, calling all the companies that were engaged in the production of ammunition, and eventually failed to find one that would give him the goods on credit. The situation was stalemate, and the only way out was to turn to his father, which Ephraim did not really want to do because of the desire to manage the business independently. However, between principles and the desire to keep the company going, the latter won out. Ephraim's father was involved in the arms trade himself, and he agreed to help his son with the money by lending him the missing amount. By this time, of the available suppliers who could provide all the necessary volume of goods, the most profitable one was asking $114 per 1,000 units. But the fact that the profit decreased several times, Ephraim no longer cared. The most important thing for him was the very fact of fulfillment of the deal. A few weeks later, the customer received the ammunition, and Diveroli received a profit of $4,500. That money wasn't nearly worth the stress Ephraim had endured in recent weeks, but he got much more than just money. He got the status of a federal contractor with a done deal with the Department of Defense. If there was a point of no return in this story, Ephraim had just passed it. AEY, which in the future was to become a symbol of the Pentagon's venality and irresponsibility, was founded by Diveroli Sr. and named after the first letters of his children's names. Once Diveroli Sr. had planned to use it to start a printing business, but then changed his mind, and for many years, the company existed only on paper. And when Ephraim decided to go into the arms trade on his own, it was taken over by him. But since Ephraim at that time was not yet 21 years old, the minimum age for obtaining a license to sell firearms, he used the company on behalf of his father. He also issued all the necessary licenses in his own name. To Ephraim, the company would pass on paper, as you probably already realized, after his 21st birthday. But de facto, there was nothing to stop him from working, and with a company, a license, and internet access, he focused on finding interesting offers. Pretty quickly, Ephraim reached a working capital of $100,000, which he considered for a while to be the perfect amount to work with. His typical transaction back then looked like this. He would buy ammunition, for example, in New York for the full $100,000, then divide it into 3 parts and sell it to Arizona, Louisiana, and Texas for $40,000 each. Thus, his profit was $20,000. Not bad money for a young guy for a week's work. But Ephraim's existence was poisoned by the realization that while he was sweating thousands of dollars, someone else was making millions. He realized that as long as he only traded domestically, he could not make really big money. The really good sums of money were in arms shipments to the U.S. Army related to the fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, which the U.S. was doing at the same time. This situation was due to the policy that George W. Bush was pursuing. Wanting to provide everything the military in the East needed, the presidential administration decided that no one could do it better than private companies and small contractors. In those days, Bush often talked about the revival of private business, calling it one of the main components of the American economy rising from its knees. Besides, large military-industrial corporations had long ago compromised themselves in the eyes of ordinary people. These mastodons of the military complex were associated by taxpayers with insatiable businessmen whose main goal was not to provide the military with vital supplies, but to speculate and want to take a bigger piece of the military budget. Against their background, private entrepreneurs looked in a more favorable light and were trustworthy. And Bush's words were true. After he took office, the share of private military contracts grew from $145 billion in 2001 to $390 billion in 2008. Frankly, a lot of this spending could have been avoided. But in 2003, the head of the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq, former diplomat Paul Bremer, a man with virtually no military experience, decided to disband the Iraqi army and generally all local law enforcement forces. This was done in order to rid Iraq of Hussein's heavy legacy of the Ba'ath Party and its mainstay, the Republican Guard. However, it turned out to be the opposite. Lustration did not bring about the desired order, but instead plunged the country into the abyss of civil strife, and some 400,000 Iraqi military personnel were deprived of any means of livelihood. Such a short-sighted act led to the fact that the Americans had to, in fact, assemble the army anew and at the expense of their taxpayers' money. Thus, the Pentagon turned for help to the company Vinil. It had experience in solving similar problems in Saudi Arabia, but in Iraq it frankly failed. Vinil was to create 9 battalions of 1,000 men at a cost of $48 million each, but it all ended with half of the 1st Battalion deserted. The company's services were abandoned, which, however, did not prevent it from receiving $24 million for half of the battalion it had managed to organize. And there were dozens of such companies like Vinil, with a similar coefficient of efficiency equal to 0. But the services of each such company were still paid for. In June 2004, Bremer left Iraq, and responsibility for building the army fell to the interim government. A small group of Iraqi specialists was sent to the United States for an accelerated 3-week course in weapons procurement, and a local Iraqi official who had previously been a used car salesman was given a $600 million budget to spend on weapons by the end of the year. This initiative ended with the Iraqi army having helicopters that could not take off, body armor whose plates could be penetrated even by a pistol bullet, and responsible officials having foreign bank accounts. It was only then that the Pentagon decided to use its own procurement system to replenish the arsenals of the Iraqi army. Minsticky organization was created, and in the internet, on specialized resources, appeared a whole sea of ads that began with the word required. Absolutely everything was required, from boots to guns. The bidding was open to all bidders, one of whom was Defrauded. Of course, Ephraim didn't yet have enough money to participate in the big game. He couldn't bid to bring tanks to Iraq, for example. But in studying the bids, Ephraim discovered one curious pattern, which was that the Pentagon was sort of dividing the weapons into two categories. Conventionally, they could be called standard and non-standard. So, standard weapons were considered to be American weapons and NATO-style weapons. As a rule, they were very expensive. And non-standard meant Soviet-made weapons, which were many times cheaper. For example, an M16 rifle cost more than $1,000, while a used AK-47 could be bought for literally a few dollars if taken in bulk. Gradually, Defrauded will move to the trade of the second type of weapons. The first contract that Ephraim undertook to fulfill for the Iraqi army was the supply of bulletproof helmets. A Korean company agreed to sell him the necessary quantity at a price of $110 per piece, and he sold them for $125. The only thing left was to find the money to pay for the helmets and somehow deliver them. We were talking about bigger sums here. The value of the entire contract was $1,250,000, of which $300,000 he had to pay in advance. Neither Ephraim nor his father had that kind of money. So he turned to an old acquaintance of his from Los Angeles, Ralph Merrill. This 60-year-old man had made his fortune designing and installing devices as far removed from the world of guns as bank terminals. But he also had a history of service in Vietnam and an interest in guns. So much so that he even opened a small workshop that repaired and restored AK-47s and uses. He also imported uses from Zimbabwe and AK-47 ammunition from China. Thanks to this circumstance, he acquired a lot of acquaintances, which in the future will also be useful to Defrauded. Ralph didn't have to be persuaded to participate in the deal. The 3-minute phone conversation, and he agreed to give money in exchange for half of the profits. In the end, the financing fell to Merrill, but it was up to Ephraim to figure out how to get the cargo from point A to point B without any problems. Of course, the union of a 60-year-old gray-haired father of the family and an 18-year-old boy who had only recently started using a razor might seem strange. But it seems that the key here is to be found in the character of Merrill himself. He was a rugged adventurer. Besides, he knew Ephraim from Los Angeles as a very responsible and efficient guy who could be relied on. Therefore, after a successful first deal, Merrill offered Ephraim to continue cooperation on the following terms. He extends his loan and is ready to invest more money, but he wants to receive 3% of the money given by Defrauded every month. Of course, Ephraim gladly agreed to these terms. The interest was not so great, but the solution to the problem that his long-sought deal could be derailed for lack of $10,000 was invaluable. Now, with such a firm footing under his feet, he could participate in larger bids. Ephraim decided to go into the custom weapons business, and Ralph set him up with a doorman he knew. And then in our narrative appears the very man whose role in the movie by Todd Phillips was excellently played by Bradley Cooper. His real name was Heinrich Thomet. Ralph Merrill was familiar with him from the time when he sold him wholesale parts for Uzi. Merrill checked with Thomet about the price of the AK-47, as well as other goods that he had at all. The price was unusually low, which meant that Ephraim could now organize real dumping diversions, offering the Pentagon goods at a lower cost than his competitors. Thus, thanks to Ralph and Thomet, Defrauded was soon able to win the right to a multi-million-dollar arms contract in Iraq. The gamble he had made a few years earlier was certainly worth the candle. Unlike many rivals in the market, who sought to trade with a wide variety of partners as they grew, Ephraim focused entirely on just one: the Pentagon. The U.S. Army, meanwhile, had launched an operation in Iraq that was destined to go down in history as Ghost Fury, or the Battle of Fallujah. One of the objectives was to weaken the insurgency in the country. But the insurgents only responded by stepping up their attacks on U.S. posts, eventually leading to frequent refusals by soldiers to transport supplies across Iraq. And as the insurgency grew, so did the number of orders that kept showing up on FedBizOps. And of course, Ephraim saw all of this and looked for the best deals. And one of such deals almost cost him his reputation and his company, but in the end it brought him to a new level. One day he stumbled upon a contract that called for the delivery of 10,000 Kalashnikov assault rifles to Iraq. This time Ephraim, hoping to find an even lower price, decided to do without Tomat and contacted an Italian lawyer who called himself the exclusive intermediary between the buyers and the armory in Croatia. The price he offered Ephraim for the machine guns was quite good. Defrauded threw in his customary 9% commission and sent a bid to the Pentagon, which he quite expectedly won. But the Italian lawyer suddenly announced that the deal was off, because the Croatian government had not approved the sale. Wanting to fulfill his obligations, whatever it took, Ephraim called Ralph and asked if he knew someone who could quickly sell him 10,000 machine guns. Ralph explained to his younger companion that this Italian lawyer was none other than another of Tomat's middlemen. And if he, Ephraim, wanted to close the deal, he would have to go to Tomat himself, not to his cronies. Ralph gave Ephraim Tomat's phone number and email address. It was under these circumstances, far less spectacular than in the movie, that the two businessmen met. There were neither the lights of Las Vegas, nor a meeting at a game of roulette. Everything was more ordinary, but no less interesting. From now on, Ephraim was dealing with one of the most serious arms suppliers with connections in the governments of many Eastern European countries. The deal had been saved, and the further prospects were simply breathtaking. In 2004, Ephraim Defrauded earned about $1 million from trading with the U.S. government. A year later, his earnings were already almost $7.5 million. Life seemed great. He moved from his tiny studio to a luxury apartment overlooking the ocean and got a cool car. But he was not going to stop there. Ephraim continued to make deals one after another. And as the volume of operations was growing, and the hands of Defrauded did not add, he needed an assistant whom he could trust. Such was David Pacuz, which embodied on the screen Miles Teller. It is on his behalf goes narration in the movie. David was 4 years older than Ephraim, and they knew each other since high school. But while Ephraim was buying a Mercedes at 19, David was barely making ends meet at the age of 24. Todd Phillips decided not to complicate the image of Pacuz in the movie. There he is from the beginning depicted as a dealer in elite bedding in nursing homes. And while this was true, in addition to trading sheets and towels, David was still studying chemistry at a local college, as well as playing guitar for hours and dreaming of putting together his own rock band. David was only partially able to realize his dream. He never became a world-famous rock musician, but it is his song that plays at the beginning of Todd Phillips' film, and he himself made a cameo appearance there, speaking to the residents of a nursing home. But in 2005, David still dreamed of one day playing in front of a crowd of thousands of fans, and in the meantime, to support himself, combined the lingerie trade with work as a masseur. In David's eyes, the profession of a masseur was more respectable than working at McDonald's, even though sometimes his clients expected more than just a massage. However, there were some things David and Ephraim had in common. For example, David found cheap suppliers of the same towels and sheets on the internet, and then resold them to an acquaintance in Miami. It was a tiny business. The profit from the largest transaction barely exceeded $2,000. But in fact, David was doing almost the same thing as Ephraim, of course, making adjustments for the scale and nature of the goods. In the movie, the meeting of the two old friends took place at a funeral. The reality was less cinematic. This was not a reunion after a long separation. Ephraim and David spent a lot of time in common companies, but it was difficult to call their relationship particularly close. We know each other. I know you're a smart guy, and you have balls. That's why I want you to be my partner. These are the words David heard from Ephraim in December 2005. At first, Pacuz didn't take it seriously and jokingly asked how much money Defrauded was making. The answer was, "I have $1,800,000 in my bank account right now." not counting the money that's in circulation right now. This argument convinced David, and he accepted the offer, and AEY became one more employee. Officially, Pacuz was promoted to account manager. Ephraim also separately stipulated that David would work for commission only. The first deal that Defrauded could make with David was not related to AK-47s or hand grenades. The subject of the bargain was an Xbox 360 gaming console. In those days, the retail price of a single console was $400. David found a dealer willing to sell these consoles for $320 apiece. The only problem was that they were ready to sell at least 100,000 consoles for $32 million. Of course, my friends didn't have that kind of money, but the prospect of earning several million at once in one fell swoop thrilled them. For 2 weeks, Ephraim and David tried to find some hedge fund or just a wealthy person who would agree to sponsor their deal. And although in the end the guys couldn't find all the money they needed and the deal fell through, David recognized his friend's determination and business acumen, which further convinced him that he was right to work for Defrauded. The arms business didn't go anywhere either, naturally. Ephraim brought David up to speed, familiarized him with the obscure technical terms that punctuated the texts of weapons contracts. It would seem that a guy with 9 grades of education and a certified master would drown in the intricacies of references to obscure laws and dozens of notes to each of the clauses. But not so. As David later recalled, they were helped in reading complex documents by the fact that as children their parents made them devote 4 hours every day to reading the Talmud. Ephraim and David had an amazing ability to concentrate on texts and documents that would put any other person in their shoes to sleep. Working alongside a workaholic like Ephraim was not easy, but David tried. It wasn't long before he made his first deals. The delivery of 65,000 liters of propane for the U.S. Air Force Base in Wyoming, and an order for World War I rifles for Special Forces training at Fort Bragg. They didn't bring much profit, but it would have been ridiculous to expect a big score right away. You had to gain experience. In June 2006, Ephraim and David traveled to Paris. They were going to visit one of the world's largest trade shows dedicated to the arms industry, Eurosatory 2006. This biennial trade show attracts tremendous attention from both arms dealers and numerous buyers. It was there that Ephraim and David met Heinrich Thomet for the first time. And here it is finally worth clarifying why a guy who, as it would later turn out, had ties to governments almost all over the world, took on such a firm in the first place, and why he did not cooperate with the U.S. government on his own. And the fact of the matter was that by then Thomet's name was on the State Department's so-called watch list for suspected black market arms dealers. This list included, and still includes, about 80,000 names. Inclusion on this list was not a black mark. Even while on the list, it was possible to make deals with the government. Rather, the list was informational, designed to warn officials making a deal to pay attention to who they were dealing with. But at the same time, dealing with such individuals raised more questions for the government about the origin of the weapons, their quality, and many others that could seriously puzzle the selling party. Therefore, to avoid unnecessary scrutiny, Thomet was all about cooperating with AEY and other similar gasket firms. And AEY, in turn, in the contracts it signed with the Pentagon, by law could not specify the name of its subcontractor. That was the legal name of those persons or organizations that supplied them with weapons. So Thomet, with its low prices, even despite its reputation, was perfect for them. Of course, one might get the impression that the Pentagon has created a system for purchasing weapons that is not entirely legal. But there was still a certain benefit to the government. The U.S. government, by not requiring its suppliers to name their subcontractors, disassociated itself from any dealings with illegal traders. Or if we call things by their proper names, it shifted the dirty part of the deals to private companies, which had to solve their problems to the best of their ability. The U.S. government had a vested interest in trading with people like Heinrich Thomet or, for example, the more familiar to our compatriots, Victor Bout. but not wanting to deal with them publicly. So as not to tarnish its reputation, it used guys like Ephraim and David for this purpose. Essentially, they were between the hammer and the anvil, but they didn't realize it. Instead, Ephraim and David felt as if they were on top of the world. From now on, they were no longer just suppliers to the Department of Defense, which numbered in the thousands. They could rightfully call themselves international arms dealers. And the future that lay ahead could not have been imagined by any movie director. Meanwhile, things were rapidly deteriorating for the Americans and their allies in Afghanistan. Despite an overwhelming advantage in firepower and total air superiority, the Taliban resistance could not be broken. Attempts to train Afghans in military affairs ended in failure. And since the Americans themselves still had to finish their business in Iraq, they wanted to finish the formation of the Afghan army as soon as possible. The main problem was the lack of ammunition. It would seem simple. The Afghans are used to former Soviet weapons, and the warehouses of some U.S. coalition allies were full of them. Many countries sincerely wanted to help the Americans and were even willing to give these weapons for free. For example, Albania wanted to present several million rounds of ammunition as a gift to the United States. This small country, located between Italy and Greece, was preparing for NATO membership and needed to get rid of millions, if not billions, of surplus ammunition at any cost. The former ruler of communist Albania, Enver Hoxha, once lived in anticipation of a huge war on several fronts at once, with both the Americans and the Russians, turning the whole country into one huge arms depot. At first, Albania's only ally was the Soviet Union, but after Stalin's death, Hoxha did not find common ground with Khrushchev, who replaced him, and his new ally was China. Thus, Albania accumulated huge amounts of both Soviet and Chinese weapons and ammunition. But the problem was that the U.S. government simply could not take advantage of Albania's generosity, for U.S. law forbids direct agreements with foreign allies for the supply of munitions, no matter how favorable it might be even to the states themselves. The Pentagon was obliged to follow its own inconvenient procurement system. But unlike the Iraq arms shipments, the Afghan contracts were now negotiated differently. The Pentagon realized its mistake, which was that by awarding the contract to the lowest bidder, it condemned Iraqi soldiers to use the lowest quality weapons. At first, this situation was dismissed with jokes along the lines of, "What difference does it make what the Iraqis run away from the battlefield in $100 or $20 boots?" But over time, the generals realized that if they wanted to create a combat-ready army, they had to supply it with quality weapons, or at least weapons that would not explode in their hands after the first shot. The Pentagon did not want to allow a repetition of this situation in Afghanistan. So initially the contract for the supply of weapons to the Afghan army was to go to only one proven supplier. At first, the Americans wanted to purchase almost all the arsenal they needed from Russia on behalf of the Afghan government. However, this promising deal was not destined to come true. Shortly before these events, Rosaboronexport had signed a contract with Iran for the repair and modernization of the country's aircraft. Although this agreement had nothing to do with, for example, Iran's widely known, and as yet unproven, weapons of mass destruction program, the Bush administration decided to scrap the deal. The agreement with Iran made it impossible for Russia to participate because of the strained U.S. relationship with Iran. The Pentagon had to go back to the old option, the Fed Buys Ops website. On July 28, 2006, one of the largest contracts in the history of this resource appeared on it. The Afghan army needed ammunition for Kalashnikov assault rifles and Dragunov sniper rifles, 30mm grenades for underbarrel grenade launchers, shells for mortars, and much more. It was easier to say what the Afghan army did not need, and it was this contract that was to play a fateful role in the lives of Ephraim and David. The contract that abruptly changed the lives of our heroes looked like all the usual contracts that friends had concluded before. It had only one difference. This tender could have only one winner, who took everything. The day the contract appeared was clearly different from other AEY workdays. Even though David arrived at the office early in the morning, Ephraim was already there, doped up on coke. He was terribly excited, for this deal had the potential to secure him for the rest of his life. They immediately shared the skin of the unkilled bear. Unlike previous deals, where friends split all profits in half, Ephraim noticed that there was a lot more risk and, consequently, financial losses that would fall on him. Therefore, as a result of the verbal agreement, they decided that David was due only 25% of the profits from all sales under this contract. The remaining 75% went to Ephraim. The supplier for the boys in this deal was again Todd, who offered them the lowest price on the market. What's more, he could give them the opportunity to buy all the 100 million rounds of ammunition they needed in the contract in one warehouse for 4 cents apiece, which was unthinkable. Before talking to Todd, David had spent 1.5 months on the phone, calling every firm in Eastern Europe, and nowhere could he find better terms than Henry's. How come? You ask. And everything is actually very simple and fits into the familiar phrase, hand washes hand. Todd had extensive connections in the Albanian government. He was personally acquainted with the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense of Albania. That's why Todd's plan was almost perfect. Henry's own front company, Evden, would buy ammunition from MEICO, the Albanian government arms dealer, and resell it to AEY. All the bribes and kickbacks necessary for such low prices were, of course, taken by Todd. One could say that Evden and Todd personally were doing Ephraim and David a favor. A man with 9 grades of education and a certified massage therapist didn't have to figure out for himself who and how much to pay in Albania, and thus implicate the United States government in a corruption scandal. Todd also helped the guys with delivery. His old acquaintance, veteran of the Arab-Israeli wars, Sam Avivi, could transport the cargo for $63,000 for one flight from Tirana to Kabul. Were there any pitfalls here, you ask? Yes, of course there were. Todd was selling the guys Chinese AK-47 ammunition, which by law they were not authorized to supply to the U.S. Army. This ban had been in place since 2006 by the Bush administration, stating that the U.S. government was prohibited from conducting any arms deals with China that could enrich the Yellow Dragon. But at that time, they did not know about it yet, and having secured Todd's suggestion, the guys sent all the necessary documents to the Pentagon. And Ephraim, to be sure not to fail, even reduced the amount of margin from 9 to 8%. He was too much afraid that some of the bidders would figure out his trick of lowering the price and offer even less. Ephraim's fears were in vain. The boy's application was approved by the Pentagon. Henceforth, it was these 2 young rascals who were responsible for one of the centerpieces of the entire foreign policy of the George W. Bush administration. Consecutively, contract by contract, AEY was to single-handedly send over $300 million worth of arms to Afghanistan. They, not new to this business, were now trying to do everything not just well, but perfectly. David even went so far as to send the same type of letters to all American military attaches in the countries of Eastern Europe. In these letters, he asked for AEY's assistance in finding any unaccounted-for stockpiles of old weapons that might be in the attache's countries of assignment. The military attaché in Macedonia, Colonel Chris Benya, also received such a letter. He knew of the existence of AEY, and David's request seemed logical to him. The only thing that confused him was the letter itself, which was drafted with a number of errors. I was contacted today by David Pacus of AEY. Benya wrote to an Army procurement representative in Rock Island, Illinois. There are many red flags based on what he sent. There were many errors in the attached documents, including misspelling Bank of America on the letterhead and using different fonts in the purported contract. I also found it odd that the company didn't have a corporate email address and seemed to use Gmail. The bottom line is that none of this adds up. The answer from Rock Island was unequivocal. The contract with AEY is legitimate. Actually, those responsible for making such deals on the Pentagon side should have been wary a long time ago. First of all, Ephraim Diveroli's name was already on the State Department's watch list because of his numerous connections with vendors the U.S. government considered unreliable. He had been on the list since his meeting with Heinrich Thomit at the Paris Arms Show. The mere fact of being on the list did not mean any wrongdoing on his part, but it was a red flag. Second, it was worth paying attention to the heterogeneity of the deals AEY had made in the past. Old World War IA rifles neighboring with night vision devices, and grenade launchers coexisting with engineering shovels. Such promiscuity tended to draw attention to. Third, to date there has been no accounting audit of AEY records. And lastly, at least one person in the Pentagon but might have wondered how all this could have been organized by a guy who only a couple of months ago was allowed to legally help himself to booze and bars. However, Ephraim allowed for the possibility that the tax authorities would be interested in his company. He prepared a lot of documents and statements in which he increased the value of transactions several times. This was done to convince doubters that AEY had more money than it actually did. But there wasn't that much money. The Pentagon didn't pay its contracts until 30 days after the deal was finalized. Ephraim had invested everything he had, but it clearly wasn't enough. So Diveroli decided that the company should apply for progressive payments. To put it simply, prepayments. But to get these favorable terms, the company had to pass a background check. Ephraim decided to take a risk and invite the auditors to the office. Ralph Merrill's accountant helped the guys prepare for the audit, and the guys met the auditors in full force. But everything turned out just fine. As David later recalled, the auditors' visit to their office was more like grandmothers visiting their grandchildren. Ephraim joked and joked. David sat at his desk and smiled sweetly at everyone present. The commission's questions were formal. Weapons must be of high quality, delivered on time. Are you sure you can organize this? Are you sure? Well done. About the same time in the relationship between Ephraim and David appeared in the first disagreement. The bone of contention was David's desire to spend more time with his family. He had a daughter in February 2007. But Ephraim wanted David to continue to oversee the Afghan deal without distractions. Looking after his newborn daughter looked like a foolish waste of time to him. David agreed that there was now every opportunity to provide for his daughter for the rest of her life, but asked Ephraim to hire additional helpers. Thus, the company became 5 employees. By comparison, the staff of General Dynamics, AEY's competitor for weapons contracts, was several dozen times larger. In mid-February, just a couple weeks after the birth of his daughter, David traveled to Abu Dhabi, to the IDEX International Arms Show, to look for more vendors who could help with the Afghan deal. Specifically, David tried to negotiate with Russian officials from Rosaboron Export. They said that although they would like to sell him all the goods he was interested in, they could not do so because of a U.S. government ban. David then asked if it would be possible for the Russians to sell the goods to a third party, from whom AEY would then buy them back. The official replied that this is certainly an interesting thought, but he is not at liberty to make such decisions on his own. He would need to talk to his colleagues. The case was never pursued further, and David never saw the man again in his life. On March 9, 2007, AEY headquarters received an order from the Pentagon to deliver 1,100,000 GP-30 underbarrel grenade launchers, 100 million rounds of AK-47 ammunition, and other deadly toys to Afghanistan. The cost is almost $49 million. Now, Ephraim and David had no doubts that the responsibility for arming the entire Afghan army rested on their fragile shoulders. The guys needed another assistant they could trust, and that person soon became another former classmate of theirs from the synagogue in Miami Beach, Alex Podrisky. However, at first he refused Ephraim and David's offer. He was not too sympathetic to Diveroli. He thought that money spoiled him. However, Alex's refusal or agreement didn't really affect the fact that they urgently needed to find more people to fulfill such a serious contract and to continue doing other deals. Alex was clearly not enough, and expanding the staff would be anyway. It was decided to place an advertisement on the internet, which soon brought dozens of applicants for the position of tradesman to their office. The interviews with them were conducted by Ephraim himself. Subsequently, this episode of the history of the firm AEY entered the movie Todd Phillips. Everything was almost like in life, except that Ephraim did not kick out of the office smart people who dared to tell him how the acronym IBM actually stands for. AEY soon ran into trouble in its first deal on an Afghan contract. It involved the shipment of grenade launchers from Bulgaria to Afghanistan. Tomet had promised Ephraim and David to arrange air transportation at a price of $63,000 per flight. But the price of oil had managed to rise, and now the cost for that flight was already $125,000. Ephraim called Tomet and demanded that he cover the difference. Tomet, of course, refused. Moreover, he did not like the tone in which Ephraim spoke to him, and stopped returning his calls. Emails sent to his email account went unanswered as well. Several weeks went by like that. The military, meanwhile, insisted that deliveries would begin soon. In a state of near desperation, Ephraim called Ralph and asked him to contact Tomet. Ralph somehow persuaded him to take Ephraim's call. Finally, the long-awaited conversation took place. Tomet was calm and even arrogant. First of all, he's not Nostradamus. How could he have known that the price of oil would rise and jet fuel would become more expensive? Second, the price he had previously quoted to Ephraim was not a price, but a rough estimate. And third, Tomet asked, "Do you young people know the difference between a wet lease and a dry lease?" Ephraim had never heard such terms. He only kept saying like a parrot that Tomet had to cover the difference. Tomet began to explain to Ephraim, as meticulously as a child, the difference between wet and dry rent. That price he quoted earlier, $65,000 per flight, was the approximate cost of each of the 300 flights. When you book a large number of flights in advance, it comes out cheaper. It's a wet lease, and the 2 flights you want to arrange from Bulgaria to Afghanistan is a dry lease. It is for a much shorter period of time, so it is significantly more expensive. Long-term contracts are always cheaper and more profitable. Ephraim had to admit that the arguments of his senior business colleague were convincing, but that didn't change the fact that the shipment had to be delivered. David and Ephraim got back on the phones. They called the military and asked them for a small time extension. By all means, they had to find a way to make the shipments cheaper. After all, if they agreed to Tomet's request of $125,000, it would make all their efforts meaningless. Air travel would take all the profit they hoped to make. Suddenly, David came up with a stunning idea. The way to make air travel cheaper was to reduce the number of flights, and all that was needed was to repackage the cartridges that were stored in heavy wooden crates that were mounted on old and heavy pallets made of wood. And inside these wooden crates were old tin cans, something like tin cans, in which the cartridges were waiting for their time. David's mind instantly formed a ready-made solution. What if we replaced the wooden crates with cardboard boxes, transfer cartridges from heavy tin cans to plastic bags, and replace the old wooden pallets with more modern plastic ones? Now, all that was needed was to find someone in Albania itself who could help with the repacking. The only problem was that all the friends' connections were with the wily Tomet, and they didn't know a word of Albanian. And they also needed their own man who could oversee such a sensitive process on the spot. After some thought, the friends decided once again to offer Alex Podriski to work with them. There is no character named Alex Podriski in the Todd Phillips movie, and that's a shame. This eminently interesting man has been in the same company as Ephraim and David since childhood. By the time Alex joined AEY, he was already 24 years old. He was unemployed, but his background was much more eventful than David's, for example. He spoke French and Spanish and had spent a year as an English instructor in a parachute regiment in the south of France. He dreamed of getting a job with the International Rescue Committee and even applied for one, but was turned down. While his friends were buying new cars and having families, Alex worked part-time jobs and moonlighted selling pot to foreign tourists. So when David offered Alex a job at AEY for the second time, he ignored his dislike of Ephraim and accepted, especially since he was being offered a job away from Defrauded. Alex didn't plan to spend his life selling weapons, and he saw the offer to go to Albania as an adventure, a sort of trip to a third-world country where he could test himself. Podriska was given the position of logistics coordinator and a salary of $1,100 a week plus living and subsistence expenses. On April 17, 2007, Alex flew to the Albanian capital, Tirana. There he met with a local official named Gjili Pinari, who was in charge of the transaction on the Albanian side. Together, they went to the warehouse where the ammunition was stored. Alex had to assess the front of future work, but one unpleasant surprise awaited him in the warehouse. When they brought him an open box of AK-47 cartridges for inspection, he saw a sign with hieroglyphics on it. The cartridges themselves were in perfect condition, without the slightest trace of rust. But the hieroglyphic markings kept Alex on his toes. He was aware of the embargo on Chinese weapons, so he immediately contacted the guys in Miami. When David and Ephraim heard the news, they realized that they had to do something urgent if they wanted to keep the deal, because in a week the ammunition had to be in Kabul, and the guys physically had no time to find a new supplier. Actually, if Ephraim had spent at least half the money he spent on lawyers, AEY would have had plenty of opportunities to challenge the origin of the ammunition. First, the lawyers could easily prove that MEICO, the company from which AEY was buying the ammunition, had nothing to do with the Chinese military companies that the Pentagon and the Justice Department were threatening all kinds of hell for trading with. Secondly, at the turn of the 1950s-1960s, when these cartridges were produced, Chinese arms factories were called machine-building enterprises. Yes, this is pure wordplay, but this argument would sound quite convincing in court. And thirdly, despite the abundance of hieroglyphics on the boxes, these cartridges were produced in Albania. In the 1950s, with the money of the People's Republic of China, a lot of factories and enterprises were built in Albania. Enver Hoxha sought to turn agrarian Albania into an industrialized state. In fact, these were cartridges made in Albania by Albanians from Chinese metals, packed in crates, made of Chinese wood, and marked with Chinese paint. All in all, a savvy lawyer would have had a lot of room to make a difference here. But even if he didn't help, he could try to enlist the support of some high-ranking official or senator. The money Ephraim had would be enough to solve such a sensitive issue. But a guy with 9 years of school under his belt, a certified massage therapist, and a recent bargainer didn't know any of that. They had never considered how important it was to have a good lawyer and accountant on the team. They never tried to make any connections or acquaintances in Washington. All they knew how to do was sniff out deals on Fed buzz-ups. The first attempt to resolve the issue was that Ephraim wrote a letter to the Pentagon asking if Chinese origin ammunition in Albania was covered by the embargo if it had been there before the ban was imposed. The Pentagon replied that they are. An exception is possible only if personally authorized by the President of the United States. Of course, the guys did not have the president's phone number and decided to try to buy time by finding at least 2 million Albanian cartridges for the first delivery. With this question, Alex turned to Pinari, but he said that it was impossible. Even if they existed, it would be difficult to find them. And then they still had to be brought to Tirana, which would take at least 3 weeks. In such a situation, there was no other option but to take a risk and send Chinese ammunition. However, there was some good news. The Pentagon had nothing against shipments in cardboard boxes. This meant that it was almost impossible to determine whether the cartridges were Chinese or non-Chinese. The only thing that could give away the manufacturer was the branding of the factory. But of course, no one would do that. Commanders in the Army did not have time to go through mountains of documentation to find out what kind of branding was on the cartridges from each box. Plus, an Albanian entrepreneur, Kosta Tribica, whom Alex had found through an ad, was willing to do the repackaging of all the ammunition for only $240,000. Tribica spoke fluent English and had even lived in the States at one time. He had also served in the Albanian army for a long time and even, according to him, performed some missions for the CIA in the early 1990s during the overthrow of the communist regime. It is not known how much truth there was in this, but he gave the impression of a wealthy and not stupid man. Tribica was interested in the reason for the repackaging of ammunition. He could understand that replacing the heavy wooden crates with his cardboard boxes reduced the overall weight of the shipment. But why would his workers pull out the hieroglyphic signs? Without that, the repacking would take much less time. Over dinner together, Kosta asked Alex this question, and the latter told him the truth without any misgivings. Tribica listened to Alex and seemed satisfied with what he heard. Then, a few days later, Kosta told Alex that he could help their firm increase its profits. Tribica believed that the MEICO guys were profiting from AEY, and his relatives in the Albanian Ministry of Defense could help find out how much. When Ephraim learned of this unexpected offer from Alex, it piqued his genuine interest. By then, Defrauded truly hated Tomet, so he personally contacted Kosta and asked him to find out how much Tomet was actually paying MEICO for ammunition. When he heard the figure a few days later, his first words were, "Fucking thief. Fuck Tomet." A little over 2 cents per round. That's how much Tomet was paying MEICO. Tomet was making millions with little to no finger-pointing, while AEY was sweating over repackaging ammo and organizing complicated logistics. Ephraim asked Kosta if he could somehow, through his relatives in the Albanian Ministry of Defense, drive Tomet out of the deal and allow AEY to buy ammunition directly from MEICO. Kosta replied that he saw nothing impossible in this, asking in return only for a more decent payment for the repackaging of the ammunition. After this conversation, the bill for repacking the ammunition was not $240, but $500,000, and Ephraim himself urgently flew to Albania to negotiate with Pinari. Before getting on the plane, Defrauded contacted Ralph Merrill and asked him to write a letter to Tomet. It had been a long time since they had been in the kind of relationship to talk in person after it was revealed that the ammunition was Chinese. This letter informed Tomet that AEY knew the true amount of the deal it had made with MEICO and that he, Ephraim, thought it was wrong. He demanded that the terms of the contract be renegotiated. Otherwise, he threatened to remove Tomet from the deal. However, Ephraim's trip to Tirana did not result in much gain. He wanted to bring down the price, but the Albanians made it clear to him that they were not interested in selling ammunition at low prices. He even met with the son of the Albanian Prime Minister himself, Shkelsen Berisha, but the result was only a very small discount on ammunition and direct cooperation with MEICO, the price of which was the expulsion of Kosta Tribica from the business and the transfer of repackaging to Berisha's firm. Trouble continued to pile up for AEY. On May 24, a plane left Hungary with 5 million rounds of ammunition on board and headed for Kabul. It was scheduled to land in Kyrgyzstan for refueling. The plane successfully made it to Bishkek, but border guards boarded it there. A few hours later, David received a phone call from a frightened forwarder who told him that the local border guards were going to confiscate the ammunition and were demanding payment of $300,000 for each day it was stored at the airport. David was in a panic. He called the American attaché in Bishkek and briefly outlined the situation. The attaché, Colonel Plum, listened to David and promised his assistance in solving the problem. And this time, the words were not standard courtesies with nothing behind them. 2 weeks later, the U.S. Secretary of Defense himself came to Bishkek for talks. The outcome was a twofold increase in the payment for the lease of the airstrip in Bishkek for the U.S. Army, and the AEY cartridges were finally able to continue on their way. Meanwhile, Ephraim had returned to Miami. Eager to make more profits and do something to hurt Tomet, he made a deal with MEICO, and from now on each cartridge cost AEY 3.8 cents instead of 4.4 cents as before. Ammo was packed in cardboard boxes. Airplanes were taking off. It seemed like it was possible to relax a little, but Ephraim didn't think so. He decided to renegotiate David's pay. He believed he was entitled to all the profits from the Afghan deal, since it was his money that had been the basis for it. As for David's labors, Ephraim estimated them not in 25% of the total profit of $30 to $40 million, but in $280,000. Deveroli considered this amount more than enough for a year of work of his partner. David was outraged and replied to Ephraim that he would destroy him if he did not get all the money he was entitled to. He threatened his now ex-friend that he would tell all AEY suppliers in the Balkans about Ephraim's real income from the army, as well as inform the Pentagon about the real origin of ammunition from Albania. The next face-to-face meeting of the two former companions took place already in the presence of lawyers, since David, for all the years of work with Ephraim, never bothered to conclude with him at least some document allowing him to claim 25% of the deal. He had nothing to count on. Ephraim, with the appearance of a great patron of the arts, agreed to pay $280,000. But not at once, but in several installments over 2 years. David had to agree to these crumbs. There was no bravado and refusal to give up the money as in the movie. After leaving AEY, David decided to start his own arms trading company. He gave it the sonorous name Dynacore Industries, applied for all the necessary licenses, and made a company website. Very soon he even made his first deal for $200,000. He was approached by an acquaintance with whom he did business back in AEY. At the same time, Costa Tribica, who had been ousted from the Chinese ammo repackaging deal, was constantly calling and writing to Ephraim. He demanded to be put back in business, or begged for at least the money for the cardboard boxes that had become useless. Costa followed Alex, who was still in Tirana, and cursed Pineri, whom he considered the culprit of all his troubles. Costa could have been anyone, a deluded businessman, a former major in the Albanian army, but he was not an idiot. He decided to play his own game. Tribica called Ephraim and turned on the recorder on his phone. In this conversation, he got Deveroli to mention his meeting in Tirana with the Prime Minister's son. And with a recording of this conversation, he went to the editorial office of one of the largest newspapers in the country. There his story, which could provoke a powerful scandal on the eve of NATO accession, was listened to with interest. Costa decided not to stop there and called his acquaintance in the States. This acquaintance was an American of Albanian origin named Harry Kokolari, who was fighting against the government of Sali Berisha, whom he sincerely hated and considered a disaster for his native country. Kokolari, however, contacted some representatives of the U.S. Congress, as well as New York Times journalist C.J. Chivers, to whom he told everything he knew. Also joining AEY's many enemies, in addition to Costa and Kokolari and Chivers, was a man named Milton Blaine. This elderly man was just as busy tracking available contracts on Fed Bezops as Ephraim was. Like many other bidders, he was puzzled by Ephraim's success in this field and decided to fight him in his own ways. Blaine went to the State Department, claiming that AEY was labeling AK-47s, made in China, as Eastern European for sale to Iraq. Allegedly, they were being shipped from China to Bulgaria, from where they were delivered to Baghdad. Moreover, these weapons were of such appallingly poor quality that the Iraqi army had to get rid of them. Blaine's story interested not only officials but also agents from the Pentagon's Criminal Investigation Service. So interested, in fact, that months later they personally went to his home and dutifully recorded his story. Essentially, Blaine's accusations were a mixture of collected rumors and jealousy of a more successful competitor. How could Blaine have known about the AEY people's trip to China, which, by the way, never happened? Wasn't he using the State Department to simply ruin Ephraim's life? Blaine's stories were worthless, and all the investigators understood it perfectly well, But circumstances of a different nature intervened. The U.S. Criminal Investigation Service needed at least some way to prove its usefulness, to show the public the result of its work, because the scandals with the provision of the army in Iraq had not received their culprits. But in order to investigate really serious fraud in the arms trade, it was necessary to go to the war zone. And there you'd have to deal with the titans of the military-industrial complex, with an army of lobbyists and congressmen behind them. Besides, overly persistent investigations could piss off the army, which did not tolerate interference in its affairs. And then there's a 21-year-old with a feisty temper who has no political connections or even a good lawyer. You don't have to go to Iraq to get him warm. His office is in Miami, which, you'll agree, is a much more pleasant trip. To top it all off, the AEY case went to a young 35-year-old agent, Michael Mentevlos, who, like all other young agents, wanted more than anything to make a name for himself on a big case. He realized that Blaine was exaggerating the extent of AEY's wrongdoing in his story, but he also thought it was strange that a small firm with a 21-year-old at its helm could achieve such astonishing success. Mentevlos didn't believe in fairy tales. He felt that AEY's records and reports deserved at least a close reading. Over the course of 6 months, he had closely examined copies of all of AEY's contracts for the past couple of years. He was particularly interested in those contracts for ammunition from Albania. And of course, the fact that Ephraim's name was on the State Department watch list did not escape his attention. These facts were enough to obtain a search warrant for the company's offices, which was the beginning of the end of Ephraim Diveroli's brainchild. On August 23, 2007, the day, incidentally, that David was to receive his first payment from AEY, agents raided the company's office. They seized all the hard disks and paperwork they could find. Alex, having learned about the search in the company's office, quietly fled from Tirana to Italy. David, on the other hand, decided to help the investigation. More than anything else in the world, he was afraid of ending up in jail. And since he had no money for a good lawyer, his only chance to avoid any serious punishment was to cooperate fully and unconditionally with the authorities. He told the agents everything he knew and refused only the offer to go to a meeting with Ephraim with a hidden microphone. But despite the search and all further problems, AEY's activities were not stopped. The Afghan deal was just one of many that the company was pursuing. Ephraim continued to make contracts. However, Michael Mentevlos was not going to let it go. He was able to locate Alex, whom he convinced to return to Tirana for a meeting, and there recorded his account of the ammunition repackaging epic. Mentevlos visited Costa in the suburbs of Tirana, recording his testimony as well. Then he sent a special agent on a business trip to Afghanistan to find physical evidence of the testimony he had just collected. He had to travel to 22 strongholds of the Afghan army in the midst of the Taliban counter-offensive during snowstorms and try to find these cartridges there. For this purpose, the numbers of stamps that the factories producing the Chinese cartridges put on each product were found beforehand. The agent needed to compare these numbers with the numbers of the cartridges of the Afghan army, and he was able to find them. On March 28, 2008, the New York Times ran a headline, "Afghan Army Weapons Supplier Under Suspicion." This newspaper does not often accompany its materials with photos, preferring a more conservative style, but this time it changed its tradition. The article was accompanied by a photo of Ephraim and David. These photos were taken more than a year ago, when the boys were taken to the police station after a small fight. But the reader, not knowing the context and seeing the mugshots, thought they were hardened criminals. The author of the article, C.G. Chivers, questioned, how could the government give such a huge contract to a 21-year-old youth and a massage therapist? Ephraim Diveroli was portrayed in the article as an unpredictable neurasthenic drug addict. Chinese ammunition was rated by Chivers as the most dangerous and unreliable, exploding in the barrels during firing and posing more danger to the shooter than to the target. In fact, however, the army adopted millions of these cartridges, and there were no reports of misfires or any other defects. But none of that mattered to the war dogs. Their fate was already sealed. David Pacuz and Alex Podrisky were able to avoid jail time by getting off with a few months of house arrest. Alex went back to school. David is raising his daughter. Ralph Merrill spent over $1 million on lawyers and lost his business and all his savings. He received 4 years in prison. Ephraim Diveroli was similarly sentenced to 4 years in prison. After he got out of prison, he wrote a book in which he gave his own view of the story. He also tried to sue the movie company Warner Brothers. He did not like his image in the movie by Todd Phillips. His claim was that the movie positioned itself as based on real events, which in the movie was not so much. There was no wild ride into Baghdad in a truckload of guns, no meeting David Pacuz at a funeral, or much of anything else in real life. Costa Trebica was found dead on a country road near the village of Kors, in Albania, in the fall of 2008. A shotgun and a dead partridge were found next to his body. Despite the fact that his friends were unanimous in saying that he had never gone hunting in his life, his death was ruled an accident. He was allegedly hit by a car. He was never able to secure any payment from AEY or the U.S. Department of Defense. The flywheel he set in motion against Albania's Prime Minister, Sali Berisha, seems to have killed him himself. Heinrich Tomet, on the other hand, is doing just fine. According to sketchy press reports, he continues to sell arms and ammunition, and something tells me he's unlikely to stop.